Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to quickly run through the books that I've been reading this week. But before I begin on that, I also just wanted to give a quick heads up about a little read-along I'm doing via the wonderful Anne over at Anne Novella. And this is a sort of read-along of the collected fictions of Jorge Luis Borges. And, you know, just sort of like casual read, you know, nothing too major in amongst everything else I'm reading. But this is, I'm really actually genuinely excited for this because Borges is one of those authors who, when I was maybe 17 or 18, I remember reading a set of his short stories and just being completely blown away by the idea that literature could do this, that, you know, you could kind of have these really in-depth, complicated myths and fairy tales that are these weird and wonderful kind of things. It was around the same time I was reading a lot of Kafka, so really 17 or 18-year-old Bob probably should have had someone looking after him, being like, are you okay, Bob? Are you genuinely all right? But really excited to get on board and read some Borges. Please do feel free to join in any capacity. I'll link to Anne Novella's video talking about the various other books that are coming up and the other read-alongs, but just really excited to kind of get in with essentially a bit of a classic and sort of a classic author who I think is I know that I kind of keep meaning to come back to. When I reread House of Leaves last year, Borges gets referenced, and his sort of the labyrinth tale within him, within his work gthere referenced. So really excited to kind of take a bit of a deep dive into reading a lot of this. And this is very heavy, as I'm finding out. This could well be a weapon. So there we go. Anyway, I'll get on with the rest of the books. First up, I read Industrial Roots by Lisa Pike, published by Heloise Press, and I think it's just come out. And so this is a collection of short stories that are themed around particularly working class women, and it sort of does quite a lot in trying to capture their dialects and sort of the kind of conversations that they're having. And I found it really quite interesting because you've got lots of women in very different circumstances trying to sort of muddle their way through life, and sometimes that's, you know, something that feels like it's almost about to go into like a murder mystery or into a wider tale, and at other times it's sort of, you know, very much the day-to-day mundane aspects of life, but with these sort of little twists of something a little darker or a little bit more sinister. And so I really greatly enjoyed this. I think it's a really bold collection. It sort of really feels like it's trying to capture this very specific voice of these women. Yeah, just really greatly enjoy it overall. Next up, I read Landlines by Raynor Winn, and I've really enjoyed her previous two books. The Salt Path was the first and probably the most famous, and that book was all about how when her husband was diagnosed with a degenerative disease, they decided to go on this long coastal walk. They had also lost their home, and all these other sort of aspects sort of fed into it. So they went on this long coastal walk that seemed to really help him with his condition. The second book kind of picked up a bit more of that, of another trip, and Landlines really comes back to that core part because her husband Moth starts getting increasingly ill. This is non-fiction, by the way, sort of, yeah. And so it sort of reads as this sort of travel book of her taking this really long trip. And in this book, this is from Scotland to Cornwall, so basically the entire length of England. And what's really quite special, I think, about this book is it sort of there is a real joy at the wonder of nature and the ways that, you know, when they're doing this walk, they just find so much that's incredible, and they have these reflections on moments in their lives. And even actually the audiobook is especially precious because there's like a 20-minute section at the end where it's just a conversation between Raynor Winn and her husband Moth, and them just talking about the greatest cup of tea they've ever had. And one of them, you know, one of them mentions the greatest cup of tea being when they were sat on the sort of really near a volcano in Iceland. And, you know, just these incredible stories of these two people who are so clearly, so deeply in love, and trying to find out what works for them. And I think where Landlines is especially effective is that it sort of does this loop back of taking it from just being a travel piece or a memoir about his illness, and then also talks about the role that nature plays in our lives. So the way that actually there are sort of certain chemicals or certain things that trees release that actually have a really calming effect on humans. And so actually spending a lot of time, this whole idea of forest bathing or what have you, spending time around nature really helps. And so this degenerative disease, even while he is at times really struggling during this walk, Moth, her husband, is incredibly able to find new bits of joy and new reasons to be alive. And so I think this book is just really precious and really quite beautiful. And I think I really greatly enjoyed it. It kind of brought back all the things that I loved about Salt Path. And I think if you loved that book, then please do check it out. I think if you haven't read any of them so far, start with Salt Path still. There's a great moment where in Landlines where Salt Path is referenced. Because somebody sees her on the walk and just sort of says like, oh, it's you. You're the reason my friends dragged me on this long hike. I hate you. But it's in a loving way. It's a very, very good little book, and I found it really quite soothing, and it's really lovely hearing it through Raynor's voice as well on the audiobook, if you can. Next up, I read Owlish by Dorothy, published by Fitzcarraldo and translated by Natascha Bruce. And this is such a weird book, and I enjoyed the weirdness of it. I can see why it doesn't necessarily always appeal to people. It is a very strange book, but essentially we're in this sort of fictional world where there's a town called Nevers. We have a professor, Professor Q. He is this really oblivious man who is completely unaware of so much that's going on in the world and happening around him. He the weird thing about listening to this on an audiobook, in an audiobook version, was that occasionally I just thought I'd missed something because it got really weird really quickly. But no, it is just weird. So, for example, there are antique dolls, and at one point the dolls are doing various dances by themselves. At one point, there's a whole thing where we're watching as these dolls are potentially taking on a more adult purpose for Professor Q and for other people. But then there's this very strange thing that happens. So there's a character called Alice, and we've also, and then Owlish is, the title of this book comes from that, of it sort of being almost a mishearing, a sort of almost two different sides of the same coin of, is this person a doll or a real human, or they're made to be very, very similar to each other. And it's this very weird thing where the world gets increasingly dystopian and increasingly quite troubling. But in the meantime, it's just this absurd, weird book. And I kind of loved it. I thought it was just really fun for just how strange it was. I think, it just sort of has this real joy to it of kind of setting out this very surreal dystopian world, but also understanding within itself that it's a very silly and strange thing. So I really enjoyed this, and I think it's not really like anything else I've read in recent times. Next, I read The Art of Binding People by Paolo Milone, and translated by Lucy Rand. And this is a book that it's a weird one to pin down. It's a very quick read in some ways, and a really troubling one. But I think in a really powerful way. So Paolo Milone is a psychiatrist, and he, in this book, sort of guides us through some of the people he works with and the kind of the various things he sees on a ward, on a psychiatric ward. And so you've got these sort of people who, these characters who keeps on referring to, so he'll be like, oh, Laura, I see you with your blah 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 doing whatever. Oh, this person, I see you doing this. And there's this very strange sort of feel to this book, because he is both in awe of what humans are able to do and in awe of the support that people can offer each other. He is also a professional, maintaining his boundaries and thinking about how to best support patients. He's also a human who is looking at another human in front of him really struggling. He is also a human and a professional operating within a system that doesn't always necessarily give people what they need, or support them in the best way. And so there are all these kind of conflicting things where his point of view throughout the book is this sort of quite fractured and quite difficult thing to really pin down. And so I find it really interesting because there's this kind of like, if you read any kind of medical memoir or whatever, where it turns incredibly difficult. At times there are these weird moments of absurdity and humor and joy to be found, but then there's this sort of crushing feeling of how does a human process something that feels so outside of what one human could take. So yeah, this really bizarre and interesting book, with all the obvious spoiler warnings attached to something like this. I think it's and sort of trigger warnings attached to something like this. It's a very difficult read at times, but I think a very important one, at least it's sort of shining a light on what sort of psychiatry might look like. Before I go on to talk International Booker, and there are a couple on the list from that, I also just really wanted to talk about a memoir that I read and absolutely adored. I think this is just a really incredible book, a real gem, and I think a book that we've always really needed. And that is A Trans Man Walks into a Gay Bar by Harry Nicholas. And it kind of, in many ways, does what you'd expect of a typical memoir, in terms of taking us through the life of Harry and his sort of various competing senses of identity when he's younger and kind of where he is now. But he is a trans man who is now kind of, you know, he's sort of reached a period in his life where he feels a lot more secure and a lot more stable. And in this book, he kind of talks about these interesting intersections within his identity. So he is a gay man, he's a trans man, and that has various overlapping things that are quite interesting. So, for example, when he is on dates with other men, he is very aware of the fact that his body may be different to what lots of people might be expecting. He also, for example, hears gay men joking about women's genitalia or what have you, and kind of making these crass comments, and he feels deeply uncomfortable because he thinks, well, actually, there's a part of my body that you would see as this without knowing me. And, you know, he talks about the complications of, for example, accessing healthcare and trying to get the morning after pill, for example, and where that then proves quite complicated because he's not believed as being the person this morning after pill is intended for. And so he sort of talks a lot about navigating some of those trickier bits. But I think what is also so glorious about this book is that it is incredibly funny and warm and full of love, and it's sexy and it's clever, and it does so many things. And so I think it feels like such a glorious read to me because it's deeply informative. It's really well thought out. It's very sensitively written to make sure that, you know, he is very clear that this is his experience. This is not the universal experience. These are things that he himself has gone through, and other ways of experiencing dysphoria or being trans or whatever else are really valid. But equally, you know, a large part of this book is about him falling in love and about, you know, having really fulfilling sexual experiences and sometimes really unfulfilling sexual experiences. And he writes so candidly and so beautifully throughout this that I already can just feel this being one of my favorite books of the year. I think this is so well done. It's such a joy to read. I've been reading a lot of sort of dense books for either for various prize lists or just generally. And this was, you know, a few times when I was coming back from work late at night, this was just the joy that I was really looking forward to sitting down and reading. You know, I wanted a long commute on my way home just so I could really spend time with this book. I think it's an absolute joy. And I think it does so many things so well. So yeah, I really highly recommend this. It comes out in May. So despite my sort of like big praise on this, you might not be able to get your hands on it just yet. But when it does come out, you know, or pre-order it or whatever. But I do really highly urge you to check it out. I think it's a glorious, glorious book. And then we get onto the International Booker. I had mixed success. One of the books here I really loved, one of them I did not, but that's the way it goes. And so the one I didn't enjoy, let's do that first, was The Gospel According to the New World by Maryse Condé, translated by Richard Philcox. And I think it's a tricky one to describe why I didn't necessarily like it. The first 40 or so pages, I remember reading and thinking, oh, this is really good, this is really clever. It starts with essentially nativity scene. So, you know, for example, there are all these things. This kid is born on Easter Sunday. There's this whole thing around that, like nativity stories or various biblical stories threaded in. I really loved how those references happened. And then the book kind of continues in that vein. And weirdly, I don't know if it was just, I read those first 40 pages on a bus and then carried on reading the rest of the book the next day. And somehow by the time I came around to reading it the next day, I just was not in this world. And I really tried to kind of get back into it and what have you. I didn't find that was that possible. Essentially, a large part of the story is this idea of playing with biblical stories. So there's a character called Pascal, and obviously Easter, at least for many European languages, it has some kind of, mostly going on French here, but like in French it's Pike for Easter, and like many countries will have something, the way they talk about Easter will have something to do with those sort of sounds, at least Latin-based languages. I'm rambling, but Pascal, his name is therefore a bit of a reference, right? It's like almost if a character were born on Christmas Day and was called Christian, or something, where there'd be a reference that is linked to the name, right? That was a long rambly way of saying that. But I just really struggled, I think, with the rest of this. I didn't ever really fully understand the stakes in this book. And obviously you don't always have to have stakes or whatever. I kind of stopped caring about the characters fairly early on, and that feels quite horrible to say, but I just didn't really fully understand where the story was going. And I tried to kind of get back into it, but I just found myself sort of really running out of steam by the end and kind of just wanting the book to be over. But there are some glorious parts. There were some really interesting bits, but I think overall I just found it really difficult to summon much enthusiasm for it, unfortunately. So to end on a high, last but not least, we have Boulder by Eva Baltasar, translated by Julia Sanches, and the first time we've had a book originally written in Catalan on the International Booker List. And I really loved this. It's over before you know it. It's a very, very short book. But essentially, yeah, we have our main character, Boulder, who is a cook on a merchant ship. She is this slightly, not so passive character. I don't know if that's the right word, but a lot of life seems to sort of happen around her and to her, and she's often just a little bit frustrated by it. To the extent that when Sanches, her partner, decides that she wants to have a baby, Boulder is confused about what really to do here. She kind of realizes quite early on that she could have said no a little bit sooner, but she also doesn't know how to really say no to having a child. And so it kind of just happens that they start to do this. And, you know, she's already at this point relocated to Reykjavik in Iceland. She's already started to see all these changes happen around her, and she is already kind of out of place. You know, she's in Iceland. She doesn't really know that many people around her. There's one other Spanish speaker who she sort of hangs out with, but then also feels like she doesn't want to, because she doesn't like the idea that she's going to have to spend all this time with this other woman and all these various things. So instead, she kind of just is there and is quite passive and is living this life around Sanches, and the baby arrives. And this is then when so much of the book becomes about how Boulder relates to Sanches, how she relates to the kid. Without spoiling anything, I think there's a really interesting sort of twisty bit that comes towards the end. But a large part of what the book starts to look at is their relationship becomes increasingly fragile. They don't really want to spend much time together. Almost all of their focus is on the baby when they are. And so Boulder starts thinking about sort of, you know, having sex outside of the relationship, or having something that might jazz things up a little bit for her. But also at the same time, you know, it's complicated because that feels, again, she's quite passive and sort of a bit almost overwhelmed, I suppose is the word, maybe more than passive as a character. She doesn't really know what to do. There's sort of decision paralysis. There's, she doesn't really want to do the wrong thing by Sanches or by the baby. And so she kind of just lives in this very odd existence. And I just really loved what this book was doing. I thought it was just so spare. It gets to the point very, very quickly with what it's doing. And I really liked it. And I kind of want to reread it now because I'm sure there are little bits I missed, but it's a really glorious little book, I think. And that takes us to the end of all the books I've read this week, which have been really fun to check out. And if any of these sound interesting, I'd highly recommend you have a little look. But yeah, take care and speak to you all soon. I hope you are having a great week, and I will see you next week. But yes, also feel free, wherever I put this book again, please do consider joining me for some part of the Borges read-along. I'll be reading it throughout the month. Even if you want to dip in and just read little bits of Borges, like a novella or whatever, that's great. Even if you don't, I'll just eventually be talking about Borges, basically. Heads up. Anyway, speak to you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care and have a great week. Bye-bye.